In the dynamic world of private LTE networks for utilities, it's all about a collective approach toward grid modernization solutions. Join us alongside leading utilities including Ameren, Evergy, Lower Colorado River Authority, San Diego Gas Electric, and Xcel Energy, who are driving the evolution of utility private wireless networks with Anterix. Together with our 100+ member ecosystem and the Utility Strategic Advisory Board, we're de-risking private LTE investments. We're not just providing solutions. We're pioneering a cleaner, safer, more affordable, and secure energy future through 900 megahertz powered private LTE networks. By joining us, you're part of a force driving innovation, accelerating returns, and future-proofing the entire ecosystem. It's more than spectrum. It's about evolving together. Don't miss out. Embrace the power of collective action, ensuring a sustainable utility private LTE evolution.
To learn more, visit Anterix.com.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am UTC President and CEO Rusty Williams, and I want to thank you for joining us today on this edition of the UTC podcast that we call The Intersection. We call it The Intersection because UTC and its members sit at that proverbial intersection of technology and the delivery of reliable and cost-effective utility services. On this episode of The Intersection, I'm excited to have with me as my guest today, FCC Commissioner Nathan Simington. Commissioner Simington was nominated to serve as Commissioner of the FCC by President Trump and was confirmed by the U.S. Senate in 2020. Prior to serving as a commissioner at the FCC, Commissioner Simington served as a senior advisor at the NTIA, where his role was working on many aspects of telecom policy that includes spectrum allocation, spectrum planning, broadband access, and the U.S. government's role in the internet. Other career highlights include him being the senior counsel of the Bright Star Corporation, which is an international mobile device services company, and he was also in private practice. Commissioner Simington is a graduate of the University of Michigan Law School. He also holds degrees from the University of Rochester and Lawrence University. Commissioner Simington grew up in Saskatchewan, Canada, but he became a U.S. citizen and now lives in McLean, Virginia, with his wife and his 3 children. Commissioner, it's great to have you with us here on the UTC podcast today. Thank you for being here.
Rusty, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Yeah, on the podcast, you and I met 3 or 4 weeks ago and had some time together, and we talked about the industry. And on this podcast, we try to get people on with us that represent different parts of the telecommunications and the utility industry, and understand what drives them and what are the issues they face on a day-to-day basis. So we kind of get that full 360 view. And as we met a few weeks ago, I sensed very quickly your enthusiasm for what you do. You're very plugged in and you're very interested in everything going on around telecom policy and specifically with the FCC. I know many of the listeners are like myself and have been in the telecom business for a long time, particularly from a utility perspective. We think we know all about the FCC and we think we know what goes on behind closed doors every day. But from your perspective, tell us a little bit about the FCC. What do you think the role of an FCC commissioner is, or the FCC as a whole, and what's it like day in and day out?
Well, Rusty, I have to say, the FCC is an organization that's just like everyone else. We're in the process of changing now. Of course, if you look back 20, 30 years, then the phone system, the landline phone system, and the broadcasting industry would have been some of the marquee responsibilities at the FCC. We always had other responsibilities, but those would have been the most interesting ones to most people, probably the ones with the broadest public impact. But of course, the FCC is also an organization with a long engineering heritage. And now increasingly that's coming to the forefront as we ask questions about what it means to license equipment for use and import in the United States, when that equipment is increasingly software defined, and when, in the case of, for example, the utility sector, there's a lot of commercial grade equipment out there that has an FCC stamp on it and that you ought to be able to rely on. So the meaning of this has changed. It didn't make much sense to, flash the firmware in an antenna in 1970 because there wasn't a lot of, there wasn't a lot of intelligence embedded at the device level. It was all in how it was used. But these days, I think that's that role that we've always had at the FCC in equipment licensing and import is really coming to the forefront.
Yeah, and I joke a lot. I mean, I've been in the industry, as I mentioned earlier, a long time, and I joke about being burdened by history of things we've experienced through the years. And you're right, those 30, 40, 50 years ago, I wasn't here 50 years ago, but though, those years in the past, it was about the wired network, the nationwide telephony network. And less about the wireless. In the utility space, it was about having radios to be able to talk to line crews and those kind of things. But it has really grown since then. And when you look at the members that are part of the UTC organization, obviously many of them are utility participants themselves, and there's also suppliers that are providing equipment and services into that same industry. When you think about what you do, what the FCC does from telecom policy perspective, it seems to be that the obvious thought process is you're dealing with the large carriers, you're dealing with the large entities in the telecom space. When you think about companies and industries like, critical infrastructure or utilities, what kind of role do they play in what, how the FCC views the telecom world? And maybe how better can groups like UTC or the utility industry kind of interact and engage with the UTC, with the FCC itself?
That's a great question, Rusty, because I guess I would say, you highlighted how our regulatees, our direct regulatees, would have been the focus of FCC activity. And, again, if we look back to the utilities industry of the 70s and 80s, obviously you had spectrum interests that you had to vindicate, but you didn't have a lot of direct interest in how the phone system itself was run. If it was adequate, if AT&T, monopoly AT&T was doing a good job, or if the post-breakup entities were doing a good job, or at least an acceptable job, it really wasn't a matter of front burner concern for the utilities industry, especially because there was probably a limited ability to influence it anyway. I mean, at the end of the day, everyone was a taker, not a maker in the performance of the phone system. But this has changed, I think, quite a bit. And now there are a lot of parties that are not our regulatees at the FCC that nonetheless have a lot of interest in how we run our shop. So, for example, on the cybersecurity front, I raised the question of device reliability. If you look at devices before they were intelligent, then the FCC was mainly regulating the physical transmission characteristics of those devices. You'd be talking about the antenna, you'd be talking about the frequencies used, the permitted power levels, you'd be talking about the angles and tower height, things like that. But now, with devices being much more intelligent and pervasive, I think everyone is realizing that they have a cybersecurity and IT degree of exposure that didn't exist prior. Just look at multiple generation grids. So if you've got a grid that has multiple sources of generation powering it, then you need a lot of intelligence in the grid in order to adapt to fluctuating supply. You're probably going to need to have something plugged in to that in order to help you interface with power flowing into the grid from home generation. You're going to have to be managing a fleet potentially of tens or hundreds of thousands of smart thermostats. You're going to have to be looking for attack surface on all of that. And so the question is, who in the federal government is going to be your partner to work with on that? And I think since the FCC has a big role in licensing that wireless networking infrastructure, that we've got to figure out what it means to be a partner for you folks and to enable you to effectively represent your interests in this area.
Yeah, when we think of cyber, to kind of land on that topic to start with, obviously there's a lot of buzz around it, but as an industry, as a population, we have to kind of think through it. And what does that mean to me? That's kind of one of my big things. Is, there may be 1,000 things going on around me that doesn't impact me, but when those that do, I go, okay, so what does that mean to me, and what do I need to do about it? When you think of the telecom space, and I think you and I spoke about this when I was in your office, you think about the electrical part of the infrastructure, the 60 cycle world. They have not worried about that historically, but now we're finding, because most of that, the larger equipment, substation transformers and some of those type devices, they're coming from China. Right. And so there's all of a sudden, in what was a boring piece of equipment, now, you've got cybersecurity concerns. So when you look across the telecom landscape, and it could be in that part of the world, or it could be in the pure telecom part of the world, how should we look at this as an industry? I mean, is this purely a Chinese risk? I don't want to go too far down a path here, but how big is the exposure? Let me ask it that way. How big is the exposure from a cybersecurity perspective in this world we live in this combined telecom electric infrastructure world?
Well, I think let's put the China part to one side just for a second. I will get to it. It's obviously a front burner concern for everyone, but even without China, cyber attack surface has a lot of risk. There are obviously state level actors that you're concerned about, but often too, there's just some punk kid in an internet cafe, who's just doing something he maybe ought not to be doing. There was, I guess, the way I look at it, there was a sort of assumption at one point that if you wanted to mess around in telecom, you needed a certain level of capital and you needed a certain amount of personal technological sophistication. But it could very well be that some guy who only does software is able to use off-the-shelf hardware tools for increasingly powerful and sophisticated attacks. I was talking fairly recently to a professor at Virginia Tech who was saying that he has students build stingrays. Now, contemporary phone systems evolved a little past that, but he would have students build stingrays off of $30 or $35 of parts procured from Alibaba. That's the idea that you would impersonate a PBX would have been inconceivable in 1985. But the idea that you're going to impersonate a cell tower today with less than $100 worth of parts, that's not speculation, that's reality. Thousands of students do this as electrical engineering projects every year. So there's been this democratization of cyber attack capabilities, I guess I would say, including off-the-shelf capabilities that are available to people of limited sophistication or maybe one-dimensional sophistication, where they might be good at the software side but not have any special expertise on the hardware side. And the problem is when you accept intelligence into your system, then you're also accepting attack surface, particularly if it's a wireless system. And so, I think everyone has had to adapt to that change to a degree. When we did a recent cybersecurity proceeding at the commission, we started to see people come in who'd never commented at the FCC that anyone could remember. The Chinese WTO ministry came and commented, so they were clearly paying attention. But we also had, the National Association of Manufacturers, National Power Tool Association. I was thinking, what in blazes is the National Power Tool Association doing, commenting on this? Nothing against them, but they're just, not one of our frequent flyers over at the commission. But then I got thinking about it, and I realized that some of their members make wrenches that cost, mid five figures and that are used on airframes. And the cybersecurity exposure on something like that is absolutely significant. There's, maybe not so much on my, $30 Makita, handyman special that I picked up down at Home Depot, but there absolutely is a top of the market where the downstream effects in total cost of ownership and operation of this cyber equipment, frankly, they dwarf the sticker price. If someone can hack your wrenches and can potentially cause an airframe failure, well, I mean, it would be worth paying 10 times as much for the wrenches. No one wants to do that, but it would still be worth it if you could be sure that you were getting rid of that risk. Generally, we have to start thinking about total cost of ownership, including the risk overhang, in a way that just wasn't the case as devices just started getting smart 10, 15, 20 years ago. Now it's so pervasive that I think becomes the overwhelming factor, and the sticker price is almost less relevant. And I'm sure that utility operators are also thinking in these terms, that their risk management is increasingly dominating their thinking on procurement.
Yeah, and procurement is always a big deal for us. But, again, looking back in recent history, the concern from a security perspective originally, or as I got into the industry originally, was someone filling a truck full of explosives and pulling it out in front of a substation, or flying a plane into, something that could cause some local damage. But now, based on what you were just describing and what we see, I mean, you can be sitting on the other side of the world and find your way into something. And whether you're actually trying to turn, the grid off and on, or you're trying to disrupt a nuclear plant, or whatever it is you're trying to do, then it really makes it that easy in quotes, they have the ability to do those sorts of things. So it is a different world from a cyber risk perspective, and we have to look at it completely differently.
Well, Rusty, you couldn't be more right about that. I mean, obviously, we saw a few years ago when there were snipers shooting at substations that relatively low-tech interventions can already cause enormous headaches and public safety risks. But the new dimension that you're bringing in with the idea of threats embedded in the infrastructure. Well, let me put it to you this way: you were saying a little bit back that we didn't used to have to think so much about the sourcing of, for example, a transformer. um, I guess what I would say is, as if the Soviet Union had been able to manufacture transformers at competitive cost that were wired and were going to have to phone home to someone at some point, we would never have bought them. Now, of course, we were fortunate. The USSR didn't make anything that anyone wanted to buy, apart from its oil and gas. But if they had, we wouldn't have bought it. And
Right.
and I think that we're in this sort of funny situation with respect to the People's Republic of China, where they're sort of frenemies. They're such a colossal trading partner. They're such a colossal trading partner to everyone, and there's no question that there's lots of indispensable Chinese-made gear and products around us at all times. I mean, we've got to ask ourselves, is this a relationship anyone can really truly do without? On the other hand, if you don't manage the relationship, then you're just letting the other fellow have the upper hand without even trying to negotiate. And in my mind, there's no question that the utilities sector in particular has had to take Chinese equipment into its network simply because there was no domestic or friendly allied nation alternative. And it's a very uncomfortable position, I'm sure, to come before your PUC and say, well, we have to buy it because there's no alternative. The Motorola isn't in the market, Qualcomm isn't in the market, Cisco isn't in the market. We've got to buy from Quectel and Fibocom for this gear because they're the only companies that make this anymore. And yet at the same time trying to tell your PUC, which may or may not listen, that by procuring this gear, we're taking on a risk overhang that we've got to book. And we don't know exactly how big it is. And we don't know if that's ever going to come due, but we can't buy insurance against it. And what's more, we can't guarantee that people won't die. I mean, we're just doing our best efforts here.
Right.
We've got the best cybersecurity people that we can get, and we're hiring people to attack our networks all the time and try to reveal the flaws. But it's very, very difficult to audit anyone's firmware, even a friendly's. And if it comes to you in a black box and you don't really know what it does, well, that may be an impossible audit challenge. There might be 1 billion transistors. There might be 10 billion transistors in this thing. The mind boggles. There are even non-transistor logic disconnected hacks that you can do by, for example, having a strategically located capacitor that accumulates charge, and after several thousand cycles would perhaps do a power spike and overcome some element of the logic board, providing a temporary security glitch. So I view firmware as essentially unauditable, and I also view black box telecom equipment as essentially unauditable. And that's the difficulty in your industry, is that I think your folks are trying to be as responsible as they can possibly be around cybersecurity, but
Right.
they know better than anyone that ultimately they have to take this risk that no one can really gauge, because that's what the environment forces them into. And that's, I think, a very uncomfortable position to be in.
Yeah, the whole cyber part of this business now is really challenging, and we could sit and talk a couple of hours just about that topic alone. But we do have a couple of other topics that we want to address while we have you here in respect of your time. Let's talk about the nationwide need and efforts to fill the digital divide with broadband networks being built around the country. I know the FCC is involved in some of the activity that's going on, particularly federal guidelines and federal funding that will help enable some of those build outs in areas that may not have historically been economically justifiable from a pure business perspective. Talk a little bit, if you will, about the FCC's role in bridging this digital divide, and how you see, or does the FCC see the utilities as a part of the solution to that problem?
Yeah, well, with utilities, obviously there's infrastructure in place, there's right of ways in place, and in some cases there are rural electric co-ops that have specific broadband plans of their own, and that would also have the necessary poles and fiber hang capacity to become significant ISPs in their own right if they aren't already. So I guess what I would say is, when you look at the United States, you're looking at a country of just really unimaginable diversity, whether that's physical diversity, diversity of lifestyles, diversity of needs. This current administration has focused to a very large degree on fiber. And I think that's both an interesting idea and one that I want to push back on a little bit in two ways, some of which will be relevant for the broadband. I'm sorry, for the utilities role in broadband.
Mhm.
So a number of years ago, a report came out saying that it would cost $40 billion in the money of that, of I guess 2015 or thereabouts, to connect 98% of the homes in the United States to fiber to the premises, and that with $80 billion, we could get to 100%. Doesn't surprise anyone, I'm sure, that there's a power law distribution here. But I think that was fundamentally the premise behind allocating about $42 billion for block grants to states in as part of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act. And today that program is known as BEAD, and it's run by my old agency, the NTIA. So that one's off my plate now. I don't have to worry about them. That's the other guys. We still do have several broadband programs that we're running through the commission. The two most prominent ones right now are RDOF, Rural Development Opportunities Fund, and then the 5G Fund. I guess I would say that in both of these cases, the focus is on home broadband, and so utilities would want to take a very close look at what their state governments are interested in doing under the BEAD program, since those are state government administered. They definitely would want to connect and work closely, as I'm sure they are already, with the state broadband offices in each state where they operate.
Right.
But in terms of RDOF and 5G Fund, that is more funding private builds, and so there would be small ISPs in a lot of cases that are in some cases they're going to be overbuilding an existing cable plant with fiber. In some cases, it's going to be a new fiber build. Obviously, in the case of 5G Fund, it's going to be a wireless networking build, which may or may not have relevance to the utility sector. There's with all this diversity of broadband programs, I think it's hard to draw too many exact conclusions. The piece of advice I guess I would have for the utility sector in engaging with the BEAD program in particular is that state governments have found that they're sort of uncomfortable with the intense focus on fiber. Since this is a technical audience, I guess I'll just go out and say that I think we've already hit the point of diminishing returns on line speed. I don't think that the difference between 100 Mbps down and 1,000 Mbps down is going to be the deciding factor for a lot of people. I think it's much more likely that their networking connection inside the building or at the last mile is going to be what's dispositive there. And I don't know what a federal program to upgrade everyone's router would look like, and and I'm not even sure that there are a lot of companies that really do good commercial router firmware. But I think we might be pushing on a rope a little bit, trying to drive line speed through the roof. And I think that state governments have figured this out to a degree. So in a lot of cases, state governments, we're finding, and this isn't partisan, this is blue states, red states, it's everybody. The state governments, in trying to put together plans to connect to everyone in their states, are pushing back a little bit on the federal government's prioritization of fiber. And they're saying, well, actually, in some cases, high-speed, unlicensed fixed wireless is going to be the more appropriate technology. In some cases, our local terrain, it might be that you're in the Southwest and you've got very rocky terrain, or it might be that you're in Florida and you've got coral sand that chews up drill bits, whatever it might be. It might be in some cases that laying fiber just isn't that viable, or it may be that the small amount of fiber that you're able to procure for that build is going to be prioritized very late in terms of what manufacturers are willing to actually deliver to you. So your beautiful fiber plan on paper might take 10 years to cash out into actually getting people with that long sought fiber to the premises. And state governments that are looking to deliver that now might be pushing back on the feds and saying, no, actually, we think that a satellite build, or we think that that a fixed wireless build might be more applicable to what we're trying to do. So it's 50 states plus the other jurisdictions. So it's hard for me to, sum it up in one pithy quote, but I think very close engagement with state governments here, and particular on the BEAD program, which isn't ours at the FCC, is going to be what pays the biggest dividends for utilities in terms of avoiding duplicative or wasteful fiber builds and finding fiber capacity builds that are a good mix of consumer serviceable and also business and enterprise serviceable.
Yeah, I know a lot of the members that we have, utility members in UTC, are more involved in the middle mile part of the network
Yep.
as opposed to the last mile. And it's for a lot of reasons, some economic, some technical. But that seems to be a niche that that many of the utilities, whether they be electric co-ops or the large IOUs or whomever, are finding there. And it is amazing. I like your comment though about speeds. I am one of those people. I joke about things that become much more easier for us as a society. I joke about the microwave oven, right? We've had microwaves for quite a while. People like me standing in front of the microwave, tapping my foot, going, "Hey, how long does this take?" But at the same time, I have the fortunate position of having fiber based gigabit internet speeds, here in my home, and there's still days I'm going, this crappy internet, so I mean, it's not the fact that it's the network, it's a lot about me. And again, as we kind of go through our time here together, I got one more topic I want us to touch on. And I would probably be run out of office if I didn't at least bring the topic of spectrum up. Spectrum opportunities for our membership is always one of the top 3 issues that we deal with as an organization. But really, when you think about it in today's world, and we're talking about grid mod and zero carbon generation and electric vehicles and distributed energy, all the things that we know that are coming or in the process of being rolled out. All the utilities have gone from having a handful of control points and monitor points to thousands or millions in some cases. When you mentioned thermostats earlier and meters on the sides of houses, plus at some point one day there's going to be a sensor in every pole top insulator. There's going to be just millions and millions of ways to monitor the health of the network. To be able to have those types of systems and get the benefit out of them, you've got to be able to talk to them, right? If you can't talk to them, then all this is almost fruitless. And to do that to that many devices over that kind of geography, we're talking about some sort of wireless connectivity, however that manifests itself. So is the FCC and yourself, your own personal thoughts about this? We all know there's a limited amount of resources from a spectrum perspective. It's beachfront property, right? There's only so much of it. How does the FCC view the balance here of the needs of the general public for commercial services, or the needs of some public safety, to use that example, or critical infrastructure, in terms of trying to manage that beachfront property that we call spectrum? How do you guys kind of look at that and try to balance that out?
Well, Rusty, I think this is one of these interesting areas where the model that we had in the past assumed that there wasn't that much intelligence in devices. And now that we are starting to have more intelligence in devices and networks, we have more options. So that's sort of, the upside that justifies all of this security exposure that we're taking. We can do a lot more with a lot less. I mean, if you were to look at, for example, contemporary cell data allocations, and you were to project that back to, let's say, the late 80s, you would say, well, who could ever conceivably use all this? And yet, when you look at the amount of data that's transferred just every time someone watches a movie, it's
right.
That would have choked networks at one point. I mean, this dates me a little bit, but I remember putting on the old Weird Al Yankovic song. It's all about the Pentiums for my kids, and he has a line, got a T1 line in my his house, and it's like, so think about how unacceptable a T1 line speed would be for a modern user, but that would have been so cutting edge that only the most elaborate of power users would have ever had one in the late 90s. So so it changes, and I guess what I'm saying is, if you look at some of the stuff we did at the commission about 2006, what we were doing was rolling up a lot of federal services that had each been allocated specific frequencies in order to do their jobs. And then paying for them to move, paying for them to get new equipment out of the auction proceeds, and auctioning the spectrum for commercial use. Now, I don't want to say that model is always appropriate, but I do think that it's worth constantly revisiting the table of frequency allocations. Because when you look at the table of frequency allocations, very often we have things differentiated by frequency, where the equipment is now smart enough to have everything on a common, robust framework where you can start getting to, for example, larger channel size when it's not broken up into many tiny chunks. I think there's also a question of equipment modernization. The question of spectral efficiency is always hard to pin down. I mean,
Right.
what are the metrics for that? But I still think that we could make attempts at defining it. And I wouldn't want to say, for example, just by data volumes alone, but data volumes being part of that calculation would, I think, show us that there's sometimes a 5-6 order of magnitude difference between how efficiently superficially similar services use spectrum. So with the wireless, I should say unlicensed wireless for the utility sector, that's a little bit of a tough situation right now, because the problem with unlicensed is you don't really know who's causing you problems. Backtracing that is just an inherently painful thing. That was the whole idea behind licensing spectrum. It's like having a
Right.
registered address. Whose door to knock on if someone's misbehaving. But on the other hand, with unlicensed use, you find yourself in this sort of uncomfortable position where it was originally supposed to be for services that were sort of ad hoc, temporary, low power, not that ambitious. And increasingly, it's become a dependency because it's proved so useful, and there's so many great technologies that have been built on it. And now that's starting to impinge on what you folks have historically been doing in, I guess, let's call it high midband. So as far as the road forward, so first of all, I think we've got to recognize that there's very little that's worth disrupting utility functions. That's a very high price to pay, and we have to be really thoughtful about ever putting that on the table. On the other hand, when we look at the TFA, there was something that we didn't quite get over the line into a notice of inquiry in this present commission, but I think the next commission should definitely take it up. And that was prompted by the conflict, if you recall, over taking 3.7 to 3.98, the so-called C-band, so 3.7 to 3.98 gigahertz, and turning that over to commercial wireless. Prior, that had been a satellite band, and satellites were operating quietly and at relatively low power. So this didn't bother didn't bother the aviation industry too much. There weren't a lot of conflicts between these uses, but later altimeters operating in 4.2 to 4.4, some of the aviation operators started to be concerned, and the FAA started to be concerned that there would potentially be some interference, despite the rather wide separation between these bands, and that the results in public safety for aviation would not be good. So we looked at the question at the commission of what sorts of approaches we could take to start addressing spectral efficiency, and to start asking the question, what services should be targeted for consolidation and roll-up? What services should be left alone? And I think this is an area where the utility sector has both short and long-term interests. Obviously, in the short term, you've got interest in vindicating the continued safety and operation, particularly in 6 gigahertz. But I think in the long term, it's really important to help the commission to understand what long-term stability and what the long-term most desirable things for a utilities allocation would look like. Now, obviously, turning over equipment is a big ask, and that's not something that's done lightly, especially when you're talking about doing it nationwide and getting all the PUCs to cooperate. At the same time, the more input we have in terms of what the future of utility spectrum needs are going to look like from the utility sector, the more we can start addressing the question of, for example, do we need to have a permanent allocation that's set aside for cellular utilities communications for the building of private networks? Or on the other hand, will the utility sector tell us that that was a stopgap measure and they really want to be on commercial networks, which obviously they don't have to capitalize, provided that those commercial networks can get to a level of assurance of quality of service where the utility sector is confident that they're not giving up anything by going exclusively to a commercial carrier. There's a lot that needs to be explicit at the FCC, I think, about this direction, so that UTC and its member organizations have a real seat at the table in defining that future of connectivity. And as much as anything, that's what I'm hoping to accomplish by opening up these channels of communication a little bit, and making sure that everyone who's got skin in the game is also at the table, regardless of whether or not they're one of our regulatees.
Yeah, and it's a massive jigsaw puzzle, when you're trying to put it together. And what might have made perfect sense 40 or 50 years ago, is you would call into question today, potentially because of whether it's technological advancements or it's the need has shifted or whatever. I think that's always a challenge, and you do always have embedded equipment and users and things that you have to balance anytime you do anything. And one other thing I'll mention in that world is even if you look at just the critical infrastructure space, as you mentioned earlier about fiber deployment, if we had all the spectrum in the world or we had our choice, the answer wouldn't be the same for every utility. Right. You know, if a small electric co-op in Nevada, you know, it's got different needs than the large IOU in Boston. You know, and so part of the challenge and the drive for UTC and its discussions with people like yourself and the FCC is, you know, do we have options? You know, do we have something that the electric co-op in Nevada can choose that meets their needs as opposed to or something else that, you know, the large IOUs might could use. So I know it's a big challenge, but obviously that's a big deal for us. And it's even more critical for the utility critical infrastructure industry now because of the way the demands are being placed. Nobody wants the power to go off. Nobody ever wanted their power to go off, you know, right. But at the same time today, they really don't want it to go off, right? So anything we can do to help provide those services in a way that everybody expects, then, you know, we would hope to do that. Okay, so as we wind down our time, Commissioner, you know, I know we've just touched on 3 or 4 topics here. When you think of your top 10, your top 5 topics, you know, and particularly as it relates, you know, somehow to the utility space, what might that one thing be in 30 seconds or less? I know I'm asking you to box it that bad, but you know, what's the one topic that makes you takes up a lot of your time and thought cycles that we may not have discussed today?
Well, you know, Rusty, it's really important for me to get out there and talk to parties that aren't our regulatees, but nonetheless are very active in telecommunications or that have dependencies there. And one of the things that came out of that was the FCC putting together the Cyber Trust Mark program. We're excited about this. I don't want to get into too much detail today, especially because I talked a lot about cybersecurity. But overall, the thought is that there are vendors who want to do the right thing, but there's not a lot of legibility where a non-cybersecurity person can come in and say, yes, this vendor's equipment is more secure than another's. The CTM aims to change that by allowing vendors to represent exactly what they're willing to stand behind and to take some degree of liability off of the purchaser's book. So this program is still in the process of getting stood up. It's been voted in, but we're still setting up the testing labs and certification bodies. But the goal here is for the utility sector, for example, to be able to discipline its vendors. And on the other hand, for good vendors to be able to step up and say, hey, you know, my price might be higher than the dockside price in Shenzhen, but the difference is I'm willing to de-risk your book, and you can take that to your chief risk officer. You can take that to your compliance department and say, hey, they really are taking liability off our book. Doesn't that make that actually the enlightened purchase to make? So that's an area in particular where I would just love to have the utility sector ride us hard and make us realize what an effective implementation of this program would look like. Because frankly, I think that you folks are big enough that the vendors will have to pay attention if you act in a concerted fashion. And I think that'd be good for all Americans.
All right, well, great. I appreciate that. And we'll talk about that more, hopefully, as we go down the road and have more conversations. Well, thank you very much, Commissioner Simington, for being with me today. I know, again, we've kind of felt like we've rushed through a few things, but we turn around, look at the clock. It's been 30 or so minutes, and it's been great. I thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing with our audience, and we look forward to continuing the conversations and hopefully have some meaningful impact on the industry and what the FCC does as well. But I want to thank you again for being with us today.
Pleasure's all mine, Rusty. Thanks so much for the invitation.
All right, that will do it for this edition of the Intersection Podcast. I hope you'll subscribe, and I hope you will continue to look for future episodes. And with that, I wish you a great day.
Thank you for meeting us at the Intersection. For more information about the Utilities Technology Council, visit utc.org.